Welcome to Block 28 of our Celebrating the States Block of the Month. This is our version of the Indiana Star Block. For this block, you will need 4 fabrics: a light, an accent, a medium, and a dark. From the light fabric, you need to cut 1 square that is 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches and 4 squares that are 3 inches by 3 inches. From the accent fabric, you need to cut 2 squares that are 5 inches by 5 inches and 4 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. From the medium fabric, you need to cut 4 squares that are 3 inches by 3 inches. From the dark fabric, you need to cut 2 squares that are 5 inches by 5 inches and 4 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. Now it's time to sew. Set aside the light 4.5 inch square and all of the 2.5 inch squares. Put the accent and dark squares that are 5 inches by 5 inches right sides together and sew 1/4 inch away from a center diagonal line on both sides. You can use diagonal seam tape to sew on both sides of the center line from corner to corner, or you can draw a line on the wrong side of the fabric to know where to sew. When I use the diagonal seam tape, all I have to do is start on the right side of the top corner and have the bottom corner follow the black line on the left. The diagonal seam tape is very handy to use once you get the hang of it. And then we're going to do the same thing with the light and medium 3 inch squares. We're going to sew 1/4 inch away from a center diagonal line on both sides of the line. If this is the first Celebrating the States Block of the Month video you've seen, check out the playlist that has all the block videos we've made so far. We will leave a link in the description below. Once you've sewn all of the seams, cut between the seams where that diagonal line would be. You will have 4 of the large half square triangle blocks and 8 of the smaller half square triangle blocks. Lay the lighter side of the triangles down onto the ironing board. When you pick them up, they're already in the right position to press towards the dark fabric. Once all of the blocks have been pressed, it's time to head to the cutting table. Trim the larger half square triangle blocks to measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. I like to use my block lock rulers with the groove on the back to get the best result. Trim the smaller half square triangles to measure 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. Now we have all the pieces we need to make the 4 corners of the block. Combine the 8 small half square triangle blocks with the 4 dark 2.5 inch squares and the 2.5 inch squares of the accent fabric. The dark and accent squares are opposite each other, and the light triangles should point towards each other. For the rest of the block, you'll be using 1/4 inch seam allowances. Sew the accent squares and dark squares to the half square triangle blocks. Cut them apart and then press towards the squares. Now it's time to sew these two units together. Make sure the dark and accent squares are opposite each other and that the light triangles point towards each other. Make 4 of these squares. Once you're done pressing, they should measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. You can press these to one side, or if you prefer, you can press the seam open. Now all the pieces are ready to assemble into the block. Lay it out as shown and make 3 rows of 3 squares. The medium fabric should point towards the center square, and the dark fabric should always be sewn to each other. Same with the accent fabric. Once the rows are sewn, it's time to press. We're going to press towards the large half square triangle blocks. Now it's time to sew the rows together. Only 2 more seams and this block is done. The seams should nest at the corners, but I did pin just to make sure they stayed in place. The block is done and it's time to press. I'm going to press towards the center row. First I press the seams flat and then I'll flip it over onto its front so that I can press from the back side. After I've pressed it from the back side, I'll flip it over to the front and give it one last pressing from the front side. When finished, this block should measure 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. The first time I tested this block, instead of using gray fabric, I had used a lighter blue fabric. So when I got that block done, I thought it was a little too dark. So the second time I went with the gray fabric and I like the way it turned out. I think it's a beautiful block. We invite you to hit the like button, share the video with your quilting friends, leave us a comment, and be sure to subscribe so you can see all of the future Celebrating the States videos. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!